I've been talking a lot about Hassan, people like him, and how I don't agree with their brand of like leftism. And I think in an effort to be more productive in this conversation, it'd be good to introduce people to somebody on the left that I do think is great and that I do think people could watch and enjoy and get some political analysis from.
So you were looking for Hassan? It's a lot of pressure, but okay.
No, it's a full-on Hassan alternative. You're tapping in and coming into the ring. Excuse me. Hi, Mr. Lonerbox. Hello.
Hello, Mr. H3.
I can see you. Can you hear me and see me okay?
Yeah, I hear you and see you.
Thanks for calling in. I know it's super late. What time is it there right now?
Oh, it's only 11, and I'm a bit of a
that's
night
not
owl,
bad.
so I'll manage it.
And you're in Scotland, right?
Mm-hmm.
So are you a native to Scotland? I'm unaware of your background. I know you're Lebanese by background, but I don't know. Did you move to Scotland, or were you born there?
No, my family's Lebanese. I was born in Scotland. My dad's side of the family is Lebanese. My mum's side is Scottish. So I've lived here almost all my life. Lived in the Emirates for a little while. Been to Lebanon a couple of times, but mostly Scottish. Yeah.
So the reason I wanted to talk to you is just because I've been talking a lot about Hassan and people like him and how I don't agree with their brand of like leftism. I myself am a liberal and a leftist, and I think in an effort to be more productive in this conversation, it'd be good to introduce people to somebody on the left that I do think is great and that I do think people could watch and enjoy and get some political analysis from. So that's kind of like the motivation for having you on. Yeah.
So you were looking for Hassan It's a lot of pressure, but okay.
No, it's a full-on Hassan alternative. You are tapping in and coming into the ring. No, I just think you have a good perspective. I mean, where do you come from? You're definitely a left-leaning guy, but I feel like on certain topics where people go super far left, you have a more like nuanced and thoughtful take.
Yeah, so I've been pretty much on the left since I started caring about politics, barring like a small, like 14 playing World of Warcraft and listening to crazy like right-wingers online. That was maybe my one phase, but it lasted like a few months. And then after that, I've basically always been on the left. Was definitely a lot more farther left when I was younger. And then I think since I started making content about 4 years ago, kind of two things happened at once. One was I noticed that what I understood to be like the 21st century version of like a socialist or a democratic socialist was very different to what a lot of other people online saw as socialism. I kind of thought the whole USSR simping and anti-democracy and liberal values was just a thing of the past. But that happened. So I kind of realized that there was this whole tanky authoritarian sphere that I didn't identify with at all. And then I also realized that just after doing more and more reading into particular topics, because I was actually creating rather than just watching other creators, I realized that I didn't always align with exactly the same conclusions. So I think the first example was Ukraine. What I would normally do in my 20s was I would just, if I wanted to know something, I'd see there's an issue, and I'd say, okay, what's the left-wing commentators saying about that? And I would tend to just go with that and trust it. But when Ukraine happened, I decided that, well, I'm a creator now, I should probably just dive into this myself and see where it gets me. And I realized fairly quickly after reading more and more about that conflict and the history and what was going on now, that I didn't align with the far left position on it at all, really. That all this talk about we're going to hand-wring about the Azov battalion, like a group of like 1,000 or 2,000 people at most, some of whom were Nazis.
The so-called
like,
Nazis.
Yeah. And this is why we have to like this, and that's the level of purity testing that we're going to do to let a country of like tens of millions of people not get the arms that they need to defend themselves. I thought that was kind of ridiculous. Or conspiracy theories about a US-backed coup in 2014 in the Euromaidan. So I very quickly realized that there was this whole pile of things that I didn't really identify with coming from voices that I trusted. And then from then on, I've come across that maybe a bit more often. still lean pretty far left compared to the average person, at least in the UK or America. Like I definitely align with social democratic policies. I like workplace democracy. I think governments should support more of that. But yeah, definitely a little bit different from what I understood the left to be online. Yeah.
Yeah, I kind of went through the same thing that people saw here is that I didn't really understand what like I thought socialist when I heard that I didn't really think like oh communism like Marxism I thought like social democracy like Bernie Sanders but when I started talking about like communism with Hassan and then right afterwards October 7th happened I started to like realize that this like in my opinion this like left wing like tanky adjacent shit was so fucking nasty, and I felt like I had to get away from it. Like it was just scared me. Like what the fuck? It was crazy.
Well, I've been watching it from a distance, you know, like I think there's been definitely a few periods where I've just became like an H3 Hassan, whatever React channel because it's
Yeah,
I think like because I tend to like to go into deep dives about certain topics, but then I also realize that watching other channels talk about things like that and hearing disagreements is like a good way to springboard to get those conversations going. But yeah, and it's difficult to assess proportionally because in the real world, people who lean that far left to a point where you've got like authoritarians and Tankies or Hamas
yeah,
supporters, it's like there's not that much of that outside. But
right.
I guess because they don't have that much political power, they have invested a lot of effort into getting a very strong presence on social media and
Mhm.
also bleeding into normie spaces as well, which is a little bit more bothersome because they might not get the votes, but like that's where an increasing number of people are getting their information from. More young
Right.
people get their information from the internet, and that's going to keep on going up and up. That's not going away, and obviously that's the space I operate in. So, kind of have to address it, and even if it feels a bit disproportionate at times.
So when I hear you talk about like Israel, Palestine, or Ukraine, I feel like you have like a really deep understanding of things. I'm curious what your research or like academic background is on this stuff.
I have no academic, so I got a degree in sociology, and
Hmm.
then that was in about 2012, 13, and then I completely ditched it and just spent the rest of the decade doing music, like music production, teaching, performance. And
Hmm.
then I always had a kind of like secondary interest in politics. Like I would read a lot or I would just watch podcasts or listen to commentators. And then eventually, after creating, I started reading more. So most of it is just like, if I ever look like I'm really well learned in a particular issue, it's usually when I was making video essays or streaming, it's usually just because I spent the week before reading as much as I could about it. So it's all just like one thing at a time, you know?
Hmm. One video you made recently that really like resonated with me is you were talking about like how left-wing anti-Semitism is manifesting right now, which is obviously something that I've been talking about and caring a lot about. I find it's really hard to explain it because there's so there's so many levels and there's so many different like ways to obfuscate. And I think a lot of people who are behaving in anti-Semitic ways don't necessarily even think that they are. And you explained it in a way that really I thought was good. And I was wondering if you, kind of what your take is on the whole left-wing anti-Semitism. Like, where's it coming from? How's it manifest?
Yeah, I mean, I hope I remember what I said because that honestly to me is just one of the most difficult questions to navigate because people don't talk about anti Semitism all that much. A lot of even Western countries that have very good education systems and where every other year in high school or even primary school they ask you about like they teach you about the Holocaust and World War II and all that, but even then there's so much that gets buried. Like in the UK, for example, like no one knows that the British basically purged the Jews like 2 or 3 times across the last 1,500 years. We learn all about the Scottish versus the English in Bannockburn, but we don't learn that Edward the First, the Hammer of the Scots, the guy who fought with the Scots, he was also the Hammer of the Jews. He borrowed a bunch of money from Jews and then didn't want to pay them back because he had fought the war with the Scots. So he just deported them all. He just purged them, and they weren't allowed back until like 500 years later. So But that's just something that never gets brought up. And then even to this day, the UK still has a fairly low Jewish population, Scotland even lower. When it comes to left-wing anti-Semitism, it's like, it's really hard to navigate because I don't think the majority of people who appear to be doing anti-Semitic things, who are on the left, are doing it out of any conscious dislike of Jews. Like, none at all. I think that it doesn't, in a right winger, it's obvious. Right wingers don't trust Jews. Like, right wing anti Semites think Jews control the world, run the banks, have a secret plan to destroy the world. But for left wingers, it's a lot more opaque. And I think their issue is more that they arrive at anti Semitic conclusions and anti Semitic sentiments completely by accident. Okay, I'm trying to think of how to explain this in a quick way, but the way I think it works, and I'm still kind of mulling this over time. I think since the Cold War ended, I think a lot of like revolutionary communists or Tankies or whatever ended up kind of lost. They didn't really have a story anymore because the big bastion of anti-capitalism was gone, right? So once that was done, I think people felt like they were in a position where, okay, well, we're not going to get global communism anytime soon. Like, the great superpower war is done. But what we can support is anything that kind of threatens the global capitalist order. I think, like, in Chairman Mao's little red book, I think he literally says, anything that is good for the enemy is bad for us, and anything that's bad for the enemy is good for us, which seems really irrational, but it's not that irrational by their own logic, because you ever heard like sort of like communists say things like, oh, every time there was an attempted revolution around the world, it was squashed by the West, right?
Every
Containment,
time,
yeah. And to an extent that did happen. Like, that was US policy, was containment, stop it spreading at all costs. So it makes sense to think that the only way that communism is going to have a chance of flourishing again is if the global capitalist order is like pushed out of the way. So anything that undermines that gives a bit of space for alternatives. And this has been kind of like part of their doctrine for the last 100 years. Even in Weimar Germany, like the German Communist Party, their number one enemy was not the Nazis. It was the Social Democrats. They called the Social Democrats social fascists. They basically, at certain points, actually aligned with Nazis on particular issues to try and get the Social Democrats dislodged from power. When it happened when the Nazis took over in 1933, the party line from the Communist Party backed by the Soviets was that, like, basically this is good that the illusion of liberal democracy and social democracy is out of the way, and this Nazi thing is just a kind of blip, and then after that, the workers are going to rise to class consciousness and we'll have a revolution, like a Soviet Germany. They maintained that line up until the mid-30s when they were getting killed, right?
Right. So how does that lead into anti-Semitism, where they're like, it's basically an anti-Western philosophy?
Well, now that you're far left, and if you're far left and you don't really have much of a story after the Cold War, then Israel-Palestine as a far leftist kind of gives you everything you want in a story, right? It gives you oppressors and oppressed. It gives you European settlers versus non-white natives. It gives you East versus West. It doesn't give you capitalism versus communism, but it does give you the great capitalist powers versus something else. So it's a big focal point for a lot of things that leftists care a lot about. And when you can, and for a lot of very complicated reasons, people get fairly disproportionately obsessed with that particular issue. And if the goal is, like, if we see that Israel and America are kind of like representatives of the global capitalist Western order, then sometimes people who don't really have that much else to support in the world in terms of communism or anti-Westernism is they'll find themselves eventually accidentally falling into supporting groups that oppose Israel, even if they are some of the most rabid anti-Semites in the world, like the IRGC or the Houthis or Hezbollah. And I think that's more or less what happens. I think they hate Israel because Israel is backed by the West. And if that means tolerating the anti-Semitism of Houthis, Hezbollah, etc., that's kind of just worth it. And if it also means occasionally repeating their propaganda points or whitewashing their anti-Semitism, then so be it.
That makes sense because, like, when I look at these people on the left, like, I know that they're not like they're not racist and hateful people, but it's so hard to like explain it because, like you said, it's almost incidental. It's like accidental, and yeah, I think the way you said that makes a lot of sense. That the other thing I've noticed about these like ultra lefty guys that kind of trips me out is how much they hate liberals. Like they hate liberals more than anybody. Like they think liberals are fascists and essentially no better than like fringe right wing, you know, radical elements in the government. And I always thought that was so crazy because I love liberal democracy. I think it's fucking awesome. You know what I mean? And when I hear these people talk, it seems like the personal freedoms that we enjoy, religion, you know, even the freedom to have to control what happens in your own workspace, right? Or speech, press, all this stuff is stuff that they don't necessarily even believe in. In fact, a lot of that stuff is probably something that would need to go under state control for the communist takeover to work. Seems like.
Yeah, it's hard to always get into their heads because I can say that I used to enable a lot of, like I used to attract a very authoritarian, like far left community, but I never really went that far myself, even back in the day. So it's like, I think in a sense there is an internal logic to it in a way because again like liberal democracy is what or social democracy essentially is what saved capitalism, right? Like that's what they'll say about Roosevelt or about the New Deal or the welfare state in Europe or the beverage. But like the idea of those things is that they allowed capitalism to survive and to basically gain the consent of the people. And although you could argue that, well, if it also results in raised living standards or anything else, then that could give people the breathing space to start thinking about alternatives for society. I guess they just don't really, they don't really buy that. That part of it I find a little bit harder to to explain because, again, it's like it's always people who enjoy all the benefits of liberal democracy, right? Like
Yeah.
you couldn't be. There is no version. There is no Chinese version of Hassan, right? They can't exist
Right.
because you
Right.
couldn't say like. You could, I don't know what the Chinese equivalent of America deserved 9/11 would be, but if you said something like that to the Chinese, or like they deserve maybe like one of the Uyghur bombings or something, like you'd find yourself in jail long before you get the chance to escape in your like sports car or whatever, right? You'd be, yeah. So that
There's
part,
an
yeah, I find
inherent
really
like
difficult to
irony
understand.
I've noticed too. Like people like Hassan who, or I mean, not him specifically, but it's like it feels like sometimes like this disease that festers inside, and it uses like its own structure to defeat it, and because of liberal values, it's hard for the society to even make the distinction of like, how do we disallow this because like we're all about the freedoms, and they're exploiting the freedoms to undermine the society we live in, and it seems somewhat like a paradox that I'm not really sure where that ends up.
I mean, that's always been one of the strengths of like a liberal democracy, though, is or especially social democracy, is that it is good at hosting its own critics more so than any other or like a regime. And I think for the most part, that's probably okay. I guess we are entering into a new phase where social media and disinformation and post-truth and everything is really hard to control, and the fact that like. But unfortunately, I think that side of things is probably getting a lot more weaponized right now by the American right, right? Like with Elon Musk buying Twitter and then using it to amplify things that he likes and to purge things that he doesn't like, and doing it with Russian money, like doing like the fact that it's like all these conspiracy theories that you would normally hear right wingers make about the Democrats, for example.
Dude, yeah, that
Yeah.
trips me out. Elon is literally like straight up George Soros. Like everything they thought George Soros was, he's like, that's who I am. Here I am. I'm fucking doing everything we said he was doing, and everyone's like, "Yeah, that's awesome. We love Elon."
And they're proud of it as well, right? They're like there was that clip, wasn't there, when they were saying, "Oh, who is the right wing George Soros?" And Elon Musk is just like, "Yeah, that's me." And then they
Oh yeah,
clapped. I thought we didn't like it when people did that. Yeah.
it's kind of mind bending. Yeah. Um, Going back to like the Middle East, one thing that drives me crazy is the admiration that you see from Western leftists for organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah. And another comparison that I always see that I feel like is not very fair, and maybe you can tell me if you agree, is there the comparison to like Nelson Mandela and the ANC when they go like, oh yeah, well, Hamas flew in and killed a bunch of civilians, but that's what Nelson Mandela did too. And now they used to be called terrorists, but now they're actually freedom fighters that we love. It seems like not an honest comparison.
It's interesting how people who accuse everyone else of being Orientalist are so quick to generalize oppressed people from very different circumstances who did very different things and basically made very different decisions. If you're comparing Mandela to Hamas or Mandela to Hezbollah because they're both labeled terrorists by some people, I'm sorry, saying that, oh, well, Mandela was labeled a terrorist. Well, okay, ISIS were labeled terrorists. So would you say that? Like we'd say, oh, ISIS were labeled terrorists. Well, so was Mandela. So big deal. Well, no, some people can be incorrectly labeled terrorists and some people can be correctly labeled terrorists. Mandela, in his own words, was completely against what people would mostly describe as terrorism. When he was actually arrested for the first time, when he was on trial, I think in the mid 60s, after the ANC had resorted to a level of violence, now what type of violence matters, he explained his position very clearly. He said, well, we tried to go on strike. They made it illegal. We had our party, the ANC, they banned it. So we had, even though striking was illegal, we held protests anyway. We held protests that we weren't allowed to do just to see what would happen or to see if we could like make a good impression. And peaceful protesters were massacred at like Sharpeville. So they decided that they had to pursue something else. They had to go underground. But even then, in his own words, they chose between different kinds of resistance, different kinds of violence. You could go for a revolution, you could pursue terrorism, you could do guerrilla warfare, you could target soldiers. But the option that Mandela chose was what he called sabotage. It was to attack government infrastructure like power plants or to interfere with the railways or the telephone communications or to pull down pylons, because the whole idea was that the goal was to make this system, the apartheid system of South Africa, ungovernable. It is not sustainable. And because the black people were the majority in South Africa, the large majority, if we do this, then you are going to be forced to concede because otherwise the state's going to collapse. And he specifically said that he chose to do that because sabotage did not involve loss of life. It's his exact words. He also said that it offered the best hope for future race relations because bitterness would be kept to a minimum. These are his exact words.
Yeah. One of his things that he said that I feel like is always overlooked is that I know that he wanted to avoid violence as much as possible because he knew it would make reunification like difficult or impossible, and that's like there's like a empathy there, or like not even an empathy, but like just pragmatic perspective where it makes sense. Where I feel like people just give Hamas and Hezbollah a blank check to just fucking kill and mayhem as civilians, and it's just all in the name of resistance. Like there's just never there's no criticism for them because they're the oppressed.
I mean, you can kill babies and call it resistance. Like it doesn't. You have to actually. If you're ever gonna, I don't like it when people say, "Oh, I oppose all political violence," because the world is a pretty nasty place, and there are some times when the only way that people can defend themselves or liberate themselves or achieve their rights is through violence. That's happened in history with colonialism or with apartheid or anything else. But just explain how it'll help. Just say, how will this act lead from A to B? Mandela was able to do that. I think he persuaded people very well on that. And when things did go overboard, when the ANC militants would occasionally, either by accident or because some people just went rogue, when they did kill civilians, they sometimes took a bit longer than others, but they effectively disowned it. They didn't like that. Or people might think necklacing. Do you know what necklacing is?
I forget um, the exact description.
It's when you take a tire, because for some reason in South Africa there are lots of tires lying around. I don't know why. They would take a tire and put it around someone's chest and shoulders. They would soak it in gasoline and then set them on fire. This was seen as like an ANC practice. But even that, most of the time that happened, it was used on other black people who were suspected of being informants. And although Mandela's wife, Winnie, supported it and spoke openly about it, the ANC hierarchy, the leaders, they actually reprimanded her for it. They distanced themselves from it because they knew it looked horrible and it didn't really achieve anything. It was just like violence for its own sake. It didn't really help anyone. So if you're going to talk about resistance, it's like, no, you don't get a magic word to just say, oh, well, that's resistance and therefore it's fine. Just explain how this will help. How did October 7th help Palestinians? How does suicide bombing help them? How does Hezbollah firing rockets that you can't aim into an area of northern Israel that's full of mixed communities? How does that help anyone? How does boarding a ship that's going from Turkey to India, that's full of people from Asia and Ukraine, and kidnapping them for a year? We still don't know where they are, by the way. How does that help Palestinians? Well, the fact is it doesn't. But you call it resistance and you make a propaganda video with music and people like it. Yeah, it's stupid.
So I know what they would say is that it brought awareness. Like before October 7th, people were not thinking about Gaza and not caring about Gaza. But after October 7th, now it became like this global movement and dialogue about it.
That's great. 40,000 Palestinians at least, by the way, it's probably more, much more, have died. But tell their relatives who survived and are walking around the rubble that you've got global attention. Israel Palestine has an insane amount of attention from the international community. They've got the last thing that they need is more attention, right? What they need is something that will actually work or that will actually lead them to get their rights. So even October 7th, like if October 7th had happened in the West Bank, honestly, okay, I'm exaggerating, but I don't think I would care as much. I don't think I would be
I wouldn't
like,
either.
yeah.
No, dude.
So,
Can I interrupt for a sec before we move on from Mandela? It was my understanding that initially Mandela was adaptive of the Gandhi philosophy of nonviolence, but he saw it wasn't getting anywhere with him, and then ultimately he felt that violent resistance was the only way to combat the apartheid.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, but it depends on what kind of violence, right? They did resolve to violence, but their violence was damaging, destroying government infrastructure. Occasionally, people did die, but that wasn't their policy. They weren't trying to kill people. They were trying to disrupt the system and make it like an impossible system to maintain. I think between the 70s and the 80s, I think 76 and 84, I think only 71 people died in MK operations. The goal wasn't to kill people. The goal was to frustrate the apartheid system. So obviously, yeah, violence is a broad term. Yeah.
You said 71 people died in what?
Between
time frame?
76 to 84, in about 8 years of
Wow.
confrontations.
Yeah, I mean that really puts it in perspective, in my opinion. Whenever people make that comparison, it's like, well,
Yeah, it's like the equivalent of saying like, if we're talking about violence for the Palestinians, there'd obviously be a difference between armed militants in the West Bank destroying an outpost, right? Or even if like a settler tries to go up and set up an outpost, like the idea of like a Palestinian armed militant going up to them with a gun and saying, no, fuck off, like go back to your own country, okay? Like that's because that's the only way they can enforce that. I'm like, okay, yeah, good, do it. Yeah, that I'd completely support that kind of behavior, but that's not what Hamas does. Hamas went into Israel proper and killed whoever, right? So
I totally agree. On the West Bank, like these people are, when you talk about like colonial settlers and stuff, like that's what's actually happening in the West Bank right now. And these people are like, I mean, more or less valid military targets, in my opinion, right? But in Israel proper, as you describe it, what would you say? Because I think a lot of these activists would say, well, actually, Israel's all stolen land. So what's the difference between the West Bank and like around Gaza? the kibbutzim around Gaza.
For to hear Americans say that, like, okay, so you would actually be fine if a Native American decided, okay, it's time, we're taking it back. We won't actually take it back. We know we won't take it back, but what we could do is we can just kill as many Americans as possible before the army comes in. Like, okay, if you concede to that, and then it doesn't make any sense. Like the idea of Israel being stolen, that's where you get into a bit of a difficult territory there when it comes to Israel being stolen land. That when people talk about colonialism and Zionism, and maybe like farther left people don't really see eye to eye with me on this at all, I think when people try to make these comparisons, I don't think it's very helpful to compare Israel, like Israeli colonialism, which I think is real. I don't think it's worth comparing it to something like to Algeria under France or British-run Kenya, because the difference is that a colony is like a place that is controlled by a mother state that has the colony there on its behalf, with the goal of plundering the land and exploiting the locals. That's the goal, right? Jewish people, in large part, didn't go to historic Palestine because they wanted to enslave locals and plunder the land. What is there to plunder in Israel-Palestine? They went there because they felt like they had gone through 2,000 years of persecution in Europe. The Middle East was a bit better, but not great. And they decided that the only way that we can actually ensure some level of safety for the Jews is to have our own state, where we exist as a majority, where we can't be persecuted by another majority. And most Jews disagreed in Europe. They thought that if we become more integrated, if we get rid of a lot of our obvious Jewishness, we'll be a bit more safe and we'll just become like regular Germans or French people. They were wrong. The Jews in Germany who watched the Nazis come to power and had all their property taken away from them, some of them killed, some of them put into camps, they were more integrated at that point than they'd ever been. That was a very well-integrated German Jewish community, and they were murdered for it. So I think if there had been no anti-Semitism in Europe and the Middle East in the 19th century, Zionism would have been a really stupid idea. It would have been a complete, like, there'd have been no reason for it. It would have been completely unjustified. That's my opinion. But because that wasn't the case, and because you're dealing here with people who don't have anywhere else to go, who don't know anywhere else, who are not going back to Poland or Brooklyn or Iraq or Libya or Yemen, well, they're there to stay. And the way I see it now with Israel-Palestine is, although the foundation of Israel was built on, I'd say, at very least problematic terms, pretty unethical actions, sometimes downright atrocities like the 48 War, those people are not going anywhere. There are two national groups who live in that area. And we know that they don't really want to share power. They don't want to share a country. So at that point, you need to say that, well, you can't just reverse histories to some ideal point. There's to some Goldilocks zone in a particular year. You have to deal with what we're given now. And what we're given now is two national groups in this land. I think the most logical thing to go from there is to separate them. One person gets their country, the others get theirs. Maybe one day they'll decide that they want to coexist in a binational state or whatever Western leftists like to talk about when they're drinking coffee. But that's not today. Palestinians need a state now. I think that's what makes the most sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, part of my issue with this whole conversation is like, even saying like, oh, I'm in favor of a two-state, like I feel like to Hassan and his community is like genocidal. Like that makes you a Zionist, right? And again, not even from like a nationalistic, Zionistic perspective, just from a pragmatic point of view, to look at that situation and say, I think we can like lift the blockade and let everybody in Gaza and the West Bank have free reign to go into Israel and basically just, fully integrated from one day, lights are on, the borders are gone, full integration. Pragmatically, that seems like a total disaster. I mean, that would be like, all the governing bodies in those areas are pretty much dedicated to violence against the Israelis, and it would just, I think it'd be crazy, right? I mean, it would be fucking mad to do that. seems
Well,
to me.
even with apartheid, like the way apartheid ended in South Africa was because at the end of the day, both groups were eventually persuaded into it. Obviously, the ANC, Mandela, offered that. He said that they wanted white people to have a future in South Africa. They considered race relations going ahead. Desmond Tutu, the Rainbow Nation, it was supposed to be. And the white population were eventually persuaded into it as well, which is why I think just before apartheid ended, there was a referendum, and the white people were asked, do you want to keep negotiating with the ANC or not? And they mostly voted yes. So you can't just like dissolve the border and just expect everything else, all else equal, to stay the same. Like at that point, you're just turning a war into a civil war. So, and
Right.
I think this bears out in the polling as well. It's like there was a poll very recently that asked Israelis and Palestinians the question: do you think the other side wants to get rid of you, either to kill you or kick you out of the land? And I think 90% of both groups said yes. I think it was like slightly more Israelis than Palestinians, but it was about 90% each. Yeah, there is a lot of distrust between these two groups. So the idea that, and I think even if you look at polling on the one state for two people versus two states, or there was one poll that actually also inserted a third option, which was one state, but an unequal state without equal rights. And the order of preference for both groups was two states first, then one state that's unequal and undemocratic. And then the last option was one state for two people. So,
Yeah, I find that that's the ironic part is like all these people who are talking about one state's the only solution. It's funny because the people who live there, none of them want one state. None of them. The Palestinians and the Israelis, nobody there wants one state. It's like
yeah,
because
generally not.
they
Yeah.
understand that it's not a viable option. It's like a non-starter of a conversation. It just seems like magical thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it necessarily has to be that way forever. But again, Palestinians they need a state now. They don't need to wait 20 years before people start to absorb the same like multicultural opinions that we have in the West, right?
So how do you make a Palestinian state with like the way that the government is now, how they're like constantly absorbing land from the West Bank and kind of just looking the other way, or in some cases just greenlighting settlers to steal what is essentially Palestinian land?
That's a pretty big question. I think the international community and the support for Palestinians should be pointed a lot more in that direction. I think there were efforts not even that long ago that involved like boycotting of products that came from the settlements. I think it was like it eventually, not too long ago, led to European companies just refusing to stock any produce that came from settlements. And it resulted in expansion at least slowing down in some areas. And people said that, yeah, this is actually hurting our enterprise. So obviously, more of that is a good thing. I think government, I think it was a really good thing that Biden started putting sanctions on settlers, and I think even maybe one or two settlements themselves, like the outposts. I think that kind of pressure is a really good thing. And I think I really wish that a lot of the activism was maybe pointed more in that direction, because to me, it's a much more black and white thing. I don't think anyone can defend settlers. I went to Israel and Palestine in the summer and interviewed people from both groups. The most frustrating conversations I ever had there was not with Palestinians who sympathized with resistance or anything like that. The frustrating conversations came from settlers, because on the one hand, they would do this thing where they would say, yeah, we're here because Israel's a small country and we need to expand our frontiers so it's harder for people to attack us, right? Like if we weren't here, the terrorists would be closer to Tel Aviv, right? It's a small country and all that kind of thing. But they'd also talk about how this is historic Jewish land. This is Joseph's tomb and Rachel's and the tomb of the patriarchs. And I would try to ask this question where I would say, like, okay, if the security issue was not a problem, would you give up this land for peace? And they wouldn't answer. Like, they would kind of skirt around the question. And I felt like such an idiot. I tried like 3 times to rephrase this question because I thought they just weren't understanding what I was trying to say. And they just still wouldn't answer. And I said, yes, because, yeah, those people they're expansionists. They just want territory. They don't care about the security. It's just something that is easier to sell to the rest of the world. So I think there's a lot that needs to change with regards to policy from Israel's allies. And I think settlements is a really big thing. I don't think it's the end of the world in terms of two states. I don't think land swapping was really the big issue in the peace process. I think the issues were more fundamental than that. But there are still, people, Israeli leftists who don't have any support behind the scenes talking about ways that you can fix the maps up to make this work. And I just think there needs to be a lot more pressure in that direction. And I think same with Palestinian leadership as well. I think if Palestinian resistance was about frustrating the settler enterprise compared to what Hamas is doing, then that would be a much more amazing thing.
That's a good point. Well, are they doing anything to the settlers? Is that even like a focal point for like Hamas?
Sometimes, so there are lots of confrontations. The problem is that they tend to go for settlers, and at least in part because they can't get to Israel. I think in was it August? I think it was August this year, the end of the month. There was an IDF raid into Jenin, like a big Hamas stronghold in the West Bank, and it's so stupid how these narratives get kind of like spun in the West. But I think the IDF went in there and they crossed quite a few lines. They bulldozed the roads, and they caused quite a bit of destruction. But I don't think anyone. I watched a bunch of left-wing channels talking about this, and Al Jazeera and the rest of it. I don't think a single one of them mentioned that. I think 11 people died in the first day of those raids. And I don't think a single outlet mentioned that every single one of those people who died was claimed by Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades, like fighters, every single one of them, on their own websites. And they even said that what they were doing was they were building explosives to use either on settler communities or on Israelis, because it happened just like a week after or 2 weeks after a botched suiciding attempt by Hamas and Islamic Jihad. They tried one in Tel Aviv and it failed. So, again, that's always been an issue. I think is like, I don't really know if there's ever been like an armed resistance sort of agreement on the Palestinian side to kind of like focus on particular targets rather than others. It seems to be like they'll go for Israelis in Israel proper. They'll go for settlements that are right on the border that are probably never going to go back, or they'll go for outposters, which I think are a lot more justified. But I don't think there's ever been like a really focused attack on one group. Yeah.
I'm kind of curious what your opinion is. If you're living in Gaza and you were born there, and obviously we all know that the conditions even before the war were pretty tough there, like 50% unemployment, like tons of poverty and no freedom of movement. So like, I guess what, I think a lot of people say, well, if they can't go and fucking, start blowing up shit in Israel, what can they do?
It's kind of like, I don't even know what an analogy is, but it's like, if you're suffering, I don't think you're not going to gain more from blowing up things in Israel, are you? Like, you don't really gain anything from that. You actually lose quite a lot, because look at Gaza now. There was a Hamas leader actually alongside Sheikh Yassin, the founder, in the early 2000s. And there was a really interesting quote from him where he basically said, let's be frank, we're not going to destroy Israel. The practical solution would be for us to have a state alongside Israel. And when we build a Palestinian state, we will not need militias. The needs for attack will stop and things will change into a civil life. There is this very small fringe of Palestinian advocates, including, they've existed in Hamas as well, where they think that one thing that Palestinians don't lack, at least before October 7th, was international humanitarian aid. They are one of the largest, if not the largest, recipients per head of humanitarian aid in the world. And in Palestinian groups, there's always these leaders who basically no one knows about or no one likes, is that they have this argument that they should use that aid and use whatever resources they have to build up themselves as much as they can, so that if we can't force Israel or Netanyahu or Sharon to negotiate with us, what we can do is build a de facto state reality on the ground that will eventually kind of in the same way that Israel did, just be like, yeah, we're here and we're not moving. And maybe if we develop ourselves up, we can engage in trade and we can push for things like that. But obviously, if your resort to Israel is to just fire at civilians with rockets that can't aim, or to go across the border and kidnap people, or go across the border and murder people, well, it's like you're going to get blockaded. You're going to get them coming to you and blowing up your military installations and attacking your soldiers. And unfortunately, if those soldiers are near civilians, civilians die as well. So
Do you think that happens on both sides? Do you think that happens from the IDF as well?
Do I think what happens from the IDF?
Innocent civilians get killed?
In what sense from the IDF? Like,
because I'm hearing you talk about it a lot on from Hamas coming into Israel and doing that, but I'm not hearing the other way. I was just curious.
Oh, what, like the IDF killing Palestinian civilians?
Yeah.
Yeah, the IDF is like in some ways, like the IDF they are like a professional state army, but they're also they're the last people you would want to be running around Gaza looking for soldiers, okay? Because even if Hamas does fight in a very cowardly way, like they hide in civilian buildings and under civilian buildings, they dress up as civilians. The IDF is an army full of like 19, 20, 21-year-olds, right? These are like bedwetters, okay? These are people who are scared, they're jumpy, they're hateful, because obviously the Israeli youth is quite right-wing. They're very angry about October 7th. And unfortunately, the IDF doesn't really have a very good system of accountability, right? I think the longest I've ever seen an IDF soldier getting jail time for murdering a Palestinian, I think it was like 3 years, maybe 4. And that's since the founding of Israel. So obviously, people who are on the ground who maybe want to take a bit of revenge and all that, might just, take a bit of liberties and just kill some people who they know don't need to be killed, are not soldiers. So yeah, that's
what scares me about this conflict overall, and I'm not coming at you. I don't know your content. This is the first I've heard of you, but I'm just saying overall, as this movement, at least from the Palestinian side, I think we should be able to talk about it more. I agree with Ethan that people are too reactionary sometimes, and that we need to have realistic standards as a starting point. But from the Palestinian point, like I've never heard, at least to my knowledge, I don't know shit about politics, but I've never heard of another movement who can't have a slogan. So my whole life, I'm Lebanese, I'm Muslim. I've always heard "River to the Sea." I've never understood it as a phrase that meant eliminate Israel. Now, when I heard that people take it that way, when I heard from Jewish people that they take it that way, I respect that. And if they think that, then I don't want to say it. But then the next thing is, okay, we can't have a slogan. Now, and again, I'm not talking about Ethan specifically. I'm just talking about my views overall.
No, it's good.
Now
By the way, this is a good conversation.
Yeah. So we're not able to have a slogan. Now we're not able to identify the enemy, because now I'm being told that Zionist is being associated with Jewish. And of course, people can use Zionist and call people Zionists where it's not true. But I don't think it's fair to say that, calling people Zionists just as a flat line is anti-Semitic. That's me personally.
You're saying using a slogan is anti-Semitic.
We can't have a slogan. We can't identify the enemy, and now we can't give aid. That's another thing too. You can't give aid because there's this fear that Hamas is going to take the aid. And either way, both sides don't agree on anything. Everyone has their own talking points, but we can all agree, at least for the most part, on the numbers. And that's what worries me, is because this is happening. I don't know what the proportional response is. I condemn Hamas, but whatever it is, it's not this.
All right, can I ask you, do you speak Arabic?
A little bit.
Okay, I don't. You know what the Arabic version is of River to the Sea, right?
No.
Min al-Maya lil-Maya Palestine Arabia. It means from water to water, Palestine is Arab. That's what it comes from originally, right? So it's like, I can see why, if you're Israeli, hearing that probably does sound like, okay, maybe this land is not for me. Maybe these people do want me gone. So I can see that. At the end of the day, I don't know. I don't think slogans are necessarily like the big issue. When I was in the West Bank, the kids coming up to us and trying to jump in front of the camera, they said "Free Palestine." It's like, okay. And you're looking around and like, okay, there's a checkpoint there that's all black because of the Molotov cocktails. There's people who are stuck at a checkpoint for like over an hour because people are being searched very, very carefully by the IDF. There are kids who have to go through a checkpoint out of school to get home. I'm like, yeah, this is pretty bad. Yeah, free Palestine. Yeah, fuck this. This is awful. So yeah, I don't know. I think as far as slogans go and optics, I think Palestinians are pretty good at that, actually, aren't they? They're actually quite good at wooing the rest of the world in terms of like looking good or being sympathetic, right? Because they have their situation is something that people should be sympathetic with. On the other end, I think
Yeah, I don't mean so much the oppressed overseas. I mean the people here who are trying to defend them. Like, there's this feeling of like, no matter what we say, we're gonna get cornered and to be called anti-Semitic or something along those lines. Whatever it is, to be a terrorist sympathizer. Any of the,
You feel like you don't, there's not a lot of freedom for somebody to just
and
criticize Israel
yes, and let
without
me be
being
clear.
accused.
That nothing to do with Ethan or Elo.
No, dude, you're
Ethan has
good.
always encouraged me to say whatever I want. I'm very thankful for that. We had a full conversation in Vegas in which he said you could talk to me as your friend, and I truly appreciate that. So this is not a reflection of you, Ethan.
I don't take it that way at all.
yeah.
This is good. This is my problem, is that like having a conversation even like remotely, like with any friction in it at all, or like this is a civil conversation we're having, is like beyond the pale. It's become beyond the pale. It's like untenable, and it's just I'm fucking over that shit. But I'm appreciative of what you're saying. I'm definitely hearing what you're saying, man.
Can I ask a question?
Sure, please, yeah.
So obviously violent resistance is like not the the optimal option. But when people are not being given aid and they're being killed, how do you propose peaceful resistance when they don't have resources to do anything at all right now?
I'm guessing you're talking pre-October 7th. Is that right?
No, I'm talking post October 7th.
Oh, for people in Gaza.
What do people propose is done right now? Because it's been a year. Like, how can resistance be shown, or like what else can people do to get this? Because you were saying like people talk about it a lot, like the play is talked about enough, but like when is it not talked about enough to when like all of these people are still dying? Like, when is enough?
I don't think people should stop talking about it. I guess it's just, when you're saying what kind of peaceful resistance, are you talking about people in the West, or are you talking about people in West Bank or Gaza? I'm not sure the question was.
She's saying that what other option? Well, it's going to happen basically, if I'm understanding you correctly.
Yeah.
Like, how do we
Obviously,
move forward?
it shouldn't.
It shouldn't happen. We don't condone of it, but. What,
And especially if you want to send aid there and people are scared that the aid will go to Hamas, which is, I understand, obviously, like there is a threat there. But if you fear that it'll be going to the terrorists, what do you do to supply aid to the innocent civilians who have been dying and are dying?
As far as I know, with international law, at least, like if you're the occupying power, you have to make sure that aid can get in. I think the American government, I don't know if you know, recently there was like a measure that was taken in October for 2 weeks where Israel, basically, the IDF, I think without getting approval from Central Command, basically decided that they were going to surround the north of Gaza. And to do that operation, they weren't going to let anything in. Okay. So they did that for about 2 weeks. And then I think that was when Kamala Harris came out and said, okay, you've got 30 days to fix this. Otherwise, we're going to reconsider selling arms to Israel. We're going to reconsider our position on aid. And that's a pretty unprecedented thing for America to do. America doesn't talk about reconsidering arms to Israel very often. And then on the very next day, Kogat, the Israeli aid distributor agency, basically posted a bunch of videos saying, look, there's a bunch of trucks going into North Gaza. We got a bunch of trucks going in. So I think getting government pressure to Israel actually does go a long way. I think it actually did get them to reverse. And although I think the final verdict from America was that Israel still could have been doing better, that they had at least they'd stopped what would be the equivalent of like a medieval siege, because that's what it was for those 2 weeks in October. So I think the problem is like, I think people are just very disproportionate with the ways that they make complaints. And then when you get disproportionate and when you exaggerate or when you throw in false things, then you don't really know where the solutions are. So for the last year or so, when people have been saying there's an inevitable famine, and like a famine is like you've got thousands of people dying of starvation like every other week. And obviously that didn't happen. But it means that people kind of like skip over what the actual issue is, because what should have been happening, I think, and what I think could have happened more from America was more pressure on Israel to actually facilitate the movement of aid throughout Gaza. Because the big problem is that, like aid agencies don't really want to go to certain areas because they're too dangerous. Sometimes places will be so lacking in aid that when they do send a convoy in, it gets rushed at and then people get shot. So it's like, I think that's probably, it's like when you assess it proportionately, I think you can come to answers a lot more easily. Yeah.
I think your question is more like people in Gaza, right, who have no access, they have no means, they can't, I mean, they're basically just like totally fucked, right, in every conceivable way. You're wondering, like, how do they resist?
Yeah, and how does this whole new generation of children like not become
Future terrorists, I'll say for you.
sorry.
Yeah, that's a.
Like
I
that,
say,
it
yeah, I get
feels
what you're
it
saying.
feels like sadly inevitable. Like all of these people, their entire existence will now be based on the fact that their like friends and family have been massacred and their
Yeah.
homes.
Yeah, sorry, I get what you're saying now. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
like,
a
how do you
really,
stop that?
that's a really hard question. So I think the only thing, I think is like maybe 5 or 6 months ago, maybe a bit less. I think American intelligence agencies were basically in agreement that Israel has achieved almost everything they can militarily by now. Like the only thing they can do left is like they go to an area, they take out the Hamas guys, and then they leave, and then Hamas tries to regroup, but they're regrouping with less resources. There's more buildings destroyed, so Israel goes in again, and it's like a diminishing return, and they're just going to weaken and weaken and weaken until there's just nothing left. But I think the only thing that can really happen for Gaza is, and this has been floated around since the summer, is that there needs to just be like a certain, like starting with one area at a time, of taking a zone that the IDF has been able to clear Hamas out of, and to just find whatever agency or any body in the world that isn't Israel, that isn't Hamas, can come in there and start to rebuild. And obviously Netanyahu, because he's a piece of shit, is obviously not really interested in pursuing that option by now. But I think that's really the only thing that can happen. Like there's no future in Gaza with Hamas. There's no future with Hamas, because if they stay, they're going to do the same thing again. They're going to rearm, they're going to rebuild, and they're going to try attack Israel again, and then Israel will respond, and then you'll get the same situation again, and more people die, and more people get radicalized. Like, yeah, they're a very self-perpetuating organization. And there's also not really, I think, anything happening with this current Israeli government. They either need to get kicked out by the locals, or they need to have a lot of pressure on them from the rest of the world. And I think with Trump coming in, that's not very likely, but I think that's what should happen. Whether we get there, I don't know.
Do you think that Bibi is like a war criminal?
Yep. I think it's
Yeah.
quite clear. In the beginning, do you know Bob Woodward, the guy who wrote that book, the journalist who wrote that book about behind the scenes conversations between
Yeah.
politicians? Yeah. He, there was one bit in there where on October 7th, until about the end of the month, there was a complete shutdown of aid going into Gaza. And the argument I heard at the time, because when I was in Israel, I met a couple of Israeli propagandists, like government propagandists, and they said that, like, oh, that only happened because there were a bunch of breaches in the border, some crossings were damaged, and you had to rebuild that to make sure and organize passage with the aid organizations so that we could actually make things function properly. But it turns out that behind the scenes, they had solved that problem, but Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, mostly Netanyahu, were insistent on keeping the border blocked, which is a war crime. Like, it doesn't matter if you're not obligated to give them anything yourself. Like, if you're an occupier, you're not obligated to be the one that buys the food and brings it there, but you are obligated 100% to allow aid to pass through there. You have to do that. And if you deny that, which it seems like Netanyahu did knowingly, and complained to Biden for pushing back against it, that's a war crime. That's a pretty grave war crime. Yeah.
It's such a shame that the government in Israel right now is so fucked, and not just even Netanyahu, but like the whole coalition is just so fucked. It's just so fucked. Yeah.
Yeah, and it doesn't really help that he's somehow managed to push his approval ratings up again because of the military successes against Hezbollah and
Yeah,
killing
I noticed
Sinwar.
that too. I noticed like people in Israel were like mega anti Netanyahu, and after it was specifically after the pager attack, I feel like that the public was like, okay, maybe we can keep the war going with Bibi or something. I don't know.
Yeah, it's just that I think with the Israelis, obviously there was a time when they were a lot more open to peace, like in the 90s and the 2000s. And then I think it was mostly the second intifada that just kind of broke everyone's brains over there.
Yeah.
And obviously pulling out of Gaza unilaterally and then seeing Hamas appear like within a year or two afterwards and firing rockets over at you, that didn't help either. But I don't think they're not stupid. So there was quite a bit of hope I got when I was like the Tel Aviv protesters, the ones who are pushing for an end to the war and for ceasefires and to pursue some alternative that isn't just like total victory or whatever that means. I think once this side of things is done and there's like a next phase of whatever comes next, I don't think Israelis are going to forget that Netanyahu, like this is in large part his fault. He posed himself as the security guy for 20 years. He said, yeah, I might be corrupt. I might be unlikable. You might hate me, but I'm the guy who keeps you safe. I'm the security guy. And then he oversees the biggest failure in Israeli security ever in their entire history. And he does this in large part because he was complacent. He thought that he had actually used his stance and his positioning to convince Hamas to stay quiet. And the entire time he was being duped to the point that people, it was like mostly a young woman actually watching the borders, would send in reports saying there's irregular movements at the border, there's irregular activity, there's buildup. And people just saying, nah, they're just doing that to keep each other busy. You know, they're not interested in a large confrontation. I think people will remember that, hopefully. And if Hamas and Hezbollah can be properly defanged and like they don't pose the same threat to Israel that they did, then I think the Netanyahu excuse for fighting massively goes away. Like if they can actually take out Hamas, then there's no excuse for the blockade. It's gone. And like every country in the world should completely disown Israel if they keep it going after that. So, I mean,
I agree that Hamas should be taken out of power, but I also have this fear that this is an excuse to make allow this genocide to basically continue. Like, I don't know what the answer is of how to remove Hamas while at the same time not massacring so many people.
yeah, and I guess that's true. And it's like even if Netanyahu weren't a war criminal, even if they did everything right by the books of the law in war, yeah, you'd still kill a lot of civilians because that's how Hamas fights. But I don't really know. That's why I think right now, because Hamas will fight forever. I don't think they're going to stop. Obviously, the right thing for them to do would be to surrender and to agree to hand over the governance of the Strip to anyone that's not the IDF and that's not Hamas. That would be ideal. But I think that's why I think the burden should be on the IDF and Israel a lot more to take parts of Gaza that they can actually secure some kind of like calm in, and then just it needs to be. I don't think Israelis and Palestinians can solve this by themselves. I think America, wherever else, Saudis, Emiratis, Qataris, I think the entire world needs to do something about this. Like, and we've done that after wars in the past, like in World War II. It took the rest of the world to repair the damage caused by that. This is not the same damage as World War II, but it's going to take international help, and I don't think that's going to happen alone.
But that's kind of what Gallant was saying, to go back to this really silly controversy, in my opinion, is that the military objectives are done, and he doesn't understand why the IDF needs to be there any longer, and he wanted to withdraw the military, which seemed like a good voice to have on the cabinet. And then, Netanyahu fired him. So it's,
Yeah, but he's kind of a fucking nutty in his own right.
I never said, well, listen, I never said anything about his character.
Yeah, no, I get it.
I mean, I said, it's so funny how people twist it. I said he's a moderating voice on the cabinet. And then people say, oh, Ethan said he's a moderate. It's like, that's totally fucking different. But, and I think this is so stupid because, like, I'm trying to have a productive conversation about this, and it just turns into, like, oh, Ethan defended Yoav Gallant, or, I don't know. Stupid.
It's not really worth it. Like, at the end of the day, there's not really that much, because I had these problems as well, but it's not really worth getting hung up on because, yeah. Gallant did say that pretty horrible thing at the beginning about no food, no aid, like human animals, whatever. Yeah, like you don't need to like him. At the end of the day, like everyone in the entire history of Israel-Palestine has done horrible shit. Everyone said and done horrible shit. Everyone, like any Palestinian leader that you like, look into their past. They've said something crazy, anti-Semitic, or supported some kind of like terror or anything else, or like even Arafat. What was he doing for the entire 20th century, right? He was coordinating attacks on civilians, like hijacking buses and killing civilians, hijacking planes. People still saw him at the end of the day. Was it wrong to say that at one point he was a potential body for peace in the region? I mean, he was. He made steps. He put forward olive branches, right? It's okay to say that about him, right? It's okay to say that about Mahmoud Abbas or anyone else. So, yeah, Gallant compared to Netanyahu was more moderate. Yeah, that's okay to say. And
yeah, he wanted to end the war. Yeah, or at least he wanted to withdraw. I don't know, but yeah, I mean, he's fucking. Yeah, he's crazy too.
Yep, still a right winger, but he, at least on that particular issue, yes, he was a bit more moderate. Yes.
Yeah. There you go. See?
I have a question, because you said that it should begin with Hamas surrendering, but not to IDF or Israel, to a third party. But what if they don't? Okay, let's say they don't. Is it okay then for all of these innocent people to keep dying until they do? How do we?
No, I don't think it's okay at all. It's never really okay when innocent people die.
So how do we target the Hamas terrorists without hurting innocent people?
I don't think you can. There's not really. That's Hamas chooses to fight on those terms, but that's also why I don't think it's the IDF's like. That's why this total victory.
So if Hamas is doing it, then. Oh, I'm sorry, didn't mean to cut you off. But if Hamas is doing it, then IDF is okay to also do that. And like we're talking about the proportions and numbers here.
So
several more Palestinians are dying.
Yeah. So there's like I don't really like the legal arguments because they just sound really cold. I think in terms of like the way that laws work, there are like arguments that the IDF can make and get away with because they can basically just say that, yeah, if you hide behind civilians, then, and that's the only way we can get to you, then we're going to have to do a strike that's going to take out the people that we're targeting, but also the civilians. But like, I don't really agree with that to the absolute end, because the problem is that you're going to do that for decades, potentially. Like you're just going to be fighting a permanent insurgency, which is why I think they should focus a lot less on, well, let's just get the bad guys and whoever dies, fuck them. It should be a lot more on trying to live with the fact that Hamas won't stop, but also to think of ways to build up alternatives in Gaza. And that's a much harder thing to do. It's a much harder thing for the IDF to do. And I do blame Hamas for that, but I think they still need to do it.
I know what you mean, though. Hamas will never, they'll never surrender. As far as I'm aware, shit, maybe I'm wrong, but it just seems like, yeah, I don't know. I think your ideas seems kind of interesting about just like partitioning pieces off and clearing it and trying to do that all the way through, but there's not really any good solutions. It's just really fucked right now.
I think sometimes, and just to be clear, like I'm not like a military expert, so a lot of this is just me reading as many opinions as I can and just trying to find the one that makes the most sense to me. So pinch of salt, all that. I think sometimes when it comes to situations like this, is like there's not really a best option or even a good option. There's just like a less bad one. Obviously, there's new information that could come out about this particular conflict that would make me change my mind on what should be done. But Yeah, I think right now when you just have this kind of like, it's always been the case that Netanyahu and Hamas like feed each other, right? Hamas helps Netanyahu because it keeps the Palestinians divided. He said that. He said that when he was justifying letting Qatari money go to Gaza. But Netanyahu also helps Hamas because when Palestinians think, well, there's no olive branch coming from this government. There's no one saying, let's bring back the peace process. So what are we going to do? Like, yeah, it's a shame.
Did that answer your question, Lena?
I don't think directly about the people who are dying, but
Well, no, I just want to clarify. So you were saying that civilians are dying in Gaza.
yeah, and it's always but civilians are dying, but and then there's a reason for justifying it, and I can't understand that.
You're saying that the civilians need to stop dying. I mean, essentially, the war needs to stop.
And yeah, I mean,
I mean, that's the only way they stop dying, right? Is if the war stops.
I don't know what the solution is. I just wish there was another way to get these to target these terrorists better, where you're not getting all these kids caught in the crossfire.
Yeah, I hear a lot of optical solutions. This would be perfect if this happened, but I never hear a realistic one. So you'll say this would be great if this happened, if the IDF stopped, they should stop. But I never hear like a realistic, and then it ends there. There's never any further realistic solution.
For
to what should
example,
happen.
I think maybe a specific question is, let's say that there is a building, apartment building of a bunch of civilians, and it's suspected that a Hamas terrorist is hiding in the building among them. Is it okay then to strike the whole building to get that one Hamas terrorist and kill all of these other people? Because just to get that one target.
I don't think so.
Yeah, I
I
would
don't
say
know
no.
who. Yeah, I would say no for sure.
I think
But that's what's happening, right?
that's like I think that's happening.
False propaganda, Lena.
It's hard to
Say
say
what?
how often that is happening. Like I'm sure it had. Like there have definitely been moments where I think it definitely had. No, it definitely has happened. Yeah.
Well, we saw
I
them
think
blowing up like the aid cars with fuck it that they thought like one terrorist was in. That was just horrible.
yeah, and
like
it turns out
kitchen,
the
like,
person
national
who made that decision, who I think was actually fired because he was breaking the rules. They were supposed to call the aid organizations and they didn't answer, but they were supposed to double check and check again because they knew that aid workers were using that route. It turns out the guy that actually signed off on that strike was a settler, a guy who opposed humanitarian aid going into Gaza, who actually argued very vehemently against aid trucks going into Gaza. So that guy was like a
That's a
full on.
systemic issue with the IDF, though, right? That a fucking someone like that would be in that position.
Yeah, and the lack of accountability is awful. But yeah, to answer the question about what one terrorist in a building full of 20 or 30 people or 50 or whatever, it's like a really difficult moral question. I know that in like law they try to solve it because they say that, well, it's legal if the collateral damage, they call it, the civilian harm, is lower than the military advantage that you're going to get from it. And it's like, okay, how do you measure these two things? Like, how do you measure a military advantage against a number of civilian deaths or human lives? You can't really do it. So I think the way that some people try to solve it is they say is like, do we have any other way of stopping this threat? And generally in law, if you don't, then you just say, well, yeah, go ahead. And then people somehow do those jobs and manage to sleep at night. But like, that's why I think that there's only so much that the IDF could have done militarily, I think, and they've probably exceeded that by now. Like they don't need to gain any more. That's why they need to go and pursue other options.
Well, so, and to represent like the Israeli perspective, they would say, so you have these terrorists that went and did this horrible attack, and then they retreated back into Gaza. And their bases are under hospitals. They shoot from schools. They embed themselves in the civilian population. They even dress as civilians when they fight. So, like, I guess I don't know what like the IDF, just to give them like a plausible road into dealing with that situation. Like, Like, what does the IDF do from the Israeli perspective? You know what I mean? I'm curious.
I mean, I'll bite the difficult bullet. Like I think that after October 7th, there was always going to be some level of IDF incursion into Gaza. That was always going to happen. You can't just let an attack like that happen onto a sovereign country and not respond to it. But
That's part of what frustrates me too, is that I see so many people like jubilant, like just like, yes, October 7th was fucking the best. And it's like, well, we all know the inevitable consequence of that is going to be like terrible. And I'm not saying it's right or even justified, but it's going to be terrible. And yeah, I find it kind of ironic. Sorry to cut you off. Go ahead.
yeah, but I guess that's just like it's still, the problem with what's happening now is that Netanyahu, obviously, and his war cabinet have given the chief of staff this job, take out Hamas, but he's not doing it with the goal of allowing Palestinians to eventually self-govern or to eventually, like stop being bombed. Or he's not really going for that. We don't know what he's going for, really. He keeps saying total victory. He keeps saying he doesn't want settlers to go into Gaza. Other people in his government obviously do want settlers to go in. That's like the really big problem, is he's never made it very clear what his total like objective is from this war. Total victory is not an objective. It's just a slogan. It doesn't mean anything. And I really think that it would behoove the Western leftists, I think, who care a lot about this issue and who can actually get the government to listen to them if they are good with their messaging and everything else, to push for something like, if it was me, if I was the Americans, I would say like, Netanyahu, this Israeli government needs to acknowledge that the IDF is not going to stay in Gaza. They're going to come out. Someone else is going to have to govern that strip, and they're going to have a state. They can't just be some kind of like non-state entity forever. And that needs to be resolved. And America can influence the PA. They can influence, to some degree, they can influence Israel with like, just with words sometimes, because Israelis actually listen to Americans. They actually care quite a lot about the American president thinks. So, yeah, I think that should be, and unfortunately that just hasn't really happened. I don't think Harris really did nearly enough to push that, and Biden didn't. But I think that's what needs to be pushed a lot harder, is that you can't just have an Israeli government forever that's just rejecting Palestinian statehood. Like, it needs to be acknowledged. And
I think it was something a lot of activists would say, well, actually, we deny that. I mean, I've heard Hassan say this, and it's a pretty popular perspective, that Hamas does not use human shields, quote unquote, or they don't use public buildings, and they don't fight like that. I think what they would say is, it's densely populated. Like, of course, how can you avoid being near a school or a fucking whatever it is, or near civilians, you know?
Yeah, I mean, people will say, it's another thing where people just play with words, right? They'll just, oh, it's guerrilla warfare. Well, okay, that doesn't make it okay. Like, just because you change the words to something that sounds nicer. If you want to get into a legal argument, people get really weird about, there are weird interpretations of what the law on human shields is, and no one really knows exactly like what it means to have an intent to co-locate your civilians with your military. But we know with Hamas that they do it for a reason, right? Like, their tunnels are underneath buildings for a reason. They're dressing as civilians for a reason. And it's in large part because they don't
Is that
really...
debatable that they dress as civilians?
No, it's not debatable. Not all of them do, but yeah, it's not debatable that they
Or
do.
that their headquarters are under hospitals? Because I see people deny that too.
So the headquarters, as far as I know, they move. There's a speech from Sinwar in about 2019, 2020, where he was talking about complaints about the headquarters location and that they'd moved it. So I know that it was under Al-Shifa for a while. I don't know if I'm sure they moved it. It seems like they moved it. But yeah, Amnesty International, who are by no means pro-Israel, they actually really don't like Israel. Yeah, they said that in 2014. And they spoke about how Hamas was using Al-Shifa to torture people that they suspected of collaboration. So, and even when the IDF raided Al-Shifa, it took them like a couple of weeks to quote unquote secure the hospital. I doubt they were spending 2 weeks just like fighting through patients. You know, like, yeah, there's obviously a Hamas presence there. We know that they use, you know what? If we're talking about Hassan and all that, like, just listen to their own words. You can go on Hamas's website, Al-Qassam PS. They have their own obituaries for soldiers who died in previous wars, they're all listed. They'll tell you everything about this soldier's career as a soldier and what they did and what they were doing when they died and where they came from. They'll also tell you what kind of military activity they were up to. They'll tell you where they were storing weapons. They'll tell you that in 2008, when Hamas were integrated into the police forces and the police buildings that had civilian cops in them were also full of Hamas soldiers. We know that one of their military installations for producing explosives was underneath a prison. We know that that they have what's called, I think it's like the militants mosque or the military mosque, Arabic translation. Yeah, we know that the very first ever Hamas weapon stockpile was discovered in a mosque. We know that that tunnel where 6 hostages were shot in the head a few months ago had a foreign journalist, a Sky News journalist, go in and verify that that tunnel entrance was underneath a child's bedroom. So Hamas won't even hide from that. They'll admit that they have tunnels. They'll admit that they do it under civilian buildings. They'll write it in the obituaries of their soldiers. But I guess that's like, it's like a concept I call Western or like leftist Orientalism. It's this idea that you're not really treating Arabs as real people when you feel like you have to do this whitewashing of their own actions, where you feel like you see like a Palestinian group like Hamas doing a thing, basically everyone agreeing they do a thing in terms of like investigations, them saying they do this thing, but you're just like, no, that's not true. Like, you're not really treating them like real people when you do that.
I guess the last thing is like Trump is president, going to be president. I personally think that that is going to be a disaster for the Palestinians, unfortunately. And it seems like he actually got a lot of Arab vote in America, or like I think he got the majority of Arab men voting for him. I think they were hoping that he would lead differently, but from where I can see, that does not seem to be. It seems to be the opposite, frankly. I don't know what you see.
With Trump, I mean, Trump is so good at being able to. He's so good at being able to just make everyone happy. Almost, when it comes to foreign policy, he somehow manages to do this thing where he is at the exact same time a hawk and an isolationist. On one minute, he'll talk about how we don't need NATO and we don't want these endless wars and we don't want to spend American arms on other countries. On the other hand, he's talking about how we're going to kick the crap out of ISIS and we're going to send troops in there, or we're going to bomb Soleimani, or like, so he's got a very strange attitude to that. And I think, honestly, his actions tend to just depend on who triggered him the day before, or who cozied up to him or complimented him enough the day before. He's very good at filling all the gaps. I think the advertising that they were doing in Dearborn was basically, I think they were just very cynically targeting multiple groups at once with different messaging. So in areas where they had Jewish communities, they would target them with advertising saying that Trump's going to be pro like Israel. He's not going to hold Israel back. He's going to let them do the job and finish the war. And Kamala Harris is a Hamas person, or Biden's a Palestinian, and Ilhan Omar is like a Muslim. Fuck those people. But then on the other end, he'll go to Dearborn and have signs talking about, I think it was like Holocaust Harris, or what I think, or was it Genocide Joe? I can't remember. I think his crowd chanted Genocide Joe once, and he just basked in it because, well, this sounds good for the moment. Doesn't matter that it's completely contradictory to everything I believe. Who did Trump appoint again for ambassador to Israel? Like a Christian?
Huckabee.
Huckabee, yeah. A guy who, most Israelis, by the way, they don't say, oh, we're God's chosen people and the West Bank is Judea, Samaria, and all that. Like, most of them don't really say it in that way. Most Israelis are secular. That guy is like, actually, I think Trump's entire cabinet is like, they're probably more extreme Zionists than most Israelis are. Like those people.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
I think you're right.
And what happened with Trump last time? He cut funding from the Palestinian Authority. He recognized the Golan Heights. He moved the embassy to Jerusalem, which was an incredible trigger point against Hamas. That's like one of the biggest insults you can do for Palestinians, is like fucking about with the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And didn't a bunch of settlers build a complex in the Golan? They called it Trump Heights.
So I don't know.
Yeah,
Wow.
he's
Trump heights?
yeah.
He loves that.
I mean, that's the thing is like even if you don't like what the Democrats did or what Biden did, I think he could have done more. It could always be worse. It could be a lot worse. And I think unfortunately with Israel, we're going to see worse with Trump and Netanyahu combined.
Oh yeah, here it is. Trump heights. That's it. That's all you need. We just need a Palestinian city called Trump Village, and then he's gonna
The
switch
Trump
sides.
Mosque, yeah.
Trump Mosque, yeah. Trump Heights. Wow. Yeah. What? Sorry.
I was just say, yeah, me and my wife, we're from Dearborn. And yeah, definitely a lot of people back home would not vote for Harris. And some of them, obviously, yeah, they were going towards Trump. And I think, me personally, I would vote for Harris just because of other people, because of women's rights and stuff along those lines. But as an Arab, the way we looked at it, for the most part, my understanding is that we feel like no one gives a shit, no one cares. Biden stood idly by. She's going to stand idly by. At least maybe with Trump, there might be a chance of something being done.
I think they thought that their vote for Trump would protest it's like a protest of the genocide.
or not voting at all.
Yeah.
As a way of protesting.
Unfortunately, it is very disappointing that Dearborn voted for him.
Yeah.
And this is like the first time in 30 years, I think, that Dearborn voted Republican. So yeah, the genocide was like a huge issue for them in this election.
The thing is, like, I totally understand their perspective, right, of the protest vote and just feeling like hopeless and just not knowing what to do.
Mm-hmm.
So I totally get where they're coming from. You know what I mean? I just hope that
But no, you're right. It probably is going to be.
I just
worse.
hope. I mean, all we can do is hope that it's not going to be more terrible than it already is.
Well, Trump is very good at exploiting people's hopelessness or emotions or anything. Yeah, that's his entire thing. Yeah.
American democracy. Last question. American democracy. 4 more years?
What, do you think we got 4 more years of American democracy?
I mean, a lot of people think that. I mean, there's a lot of people that think it's that serious.
I don't
I'd
know,
say.
Ethan, the guardrails, it doesn't matter that Trump wants to end democracy or like will disrespect any election that he doesn't win. It's the guardrail. No, yeah, it's really, I think America has enough of a safety net that it won't allow Trump to do that. But at the end of the day, America is only any country is only as good as the people who run it or the people who are in it. And if Trump can say all those things and he can do January 6th and he still doesn't concede the last election and he can win the popular vote, like maybe Americans don't want democracy, right? Maybe they don't care.
This is what they wanted. This is what we wanted. I mean, the popular fucking vote. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I need to get the fuck out of that country. Yeah, that was. Yeah.
My only hope with Trump is that because he's so old that he just fucking dies.
Yeah, and we're very fortunate that.
Yeah, because he's old. Obviously, right, Dan?
And I think we're very fortunate that a lot of his successors are kind of inept. Like they don't really have the same flair that he does. That's probably a good thing. Vivek's not replacing Trump. DeSantis, no. Trump Jr.? honestly, Trump Jr. might be, maybe if they can sell it like on a dynasty, maybe
no
they can get a Trump
He's such a
in.
creep. I don't see it.
Yeah, because Trump's definitely not a creep, eh? Like
no, but he has swag. Where
he does have swag.
Trump Jr. is just a whiny bitch, fucking cocaine addict.
I mean, Trump is a big fat man who eats a lot of McDonald's, so
opposites. One does cocaine, one does McDonald's.
Yeah, it's I don't know. That is probably, as far as like the future and just like any democracy, it's just the fact that disinformation and like just alternate realities can have that much of an effect on the population now. That's quite a scary thing looking forward. Yeah,
it is. So everybody, that's our time. Thank you for calling in. I appreciate it. And thank you to everyone who participated. Lena and Avi and Olivia. I appreciate the conversation we had. And thanks for calling in. Guys, if you want to, he's Lonerbox on YouTube. Is there anything else to say that you want to plug? I mean, it's Lonerbox.
Yeah, you can find me on YouTube, either Lonerbox or Lonerbox Live is where I do most of my content now on live streams. You can see me on Twitter if you want to see me fighting with people, but
How often do you go live these days?
pretty much every day, maybe 6 days a week these days.
Oh, okay. So Lonerbox Live. Cool.
Yeah,
very good.
thanks a lot for having me, you guys. Nice meeting
Thank
you.
you. I appreciate you calling in. Have a good evening. I know it's late there.
And
Enjoy,
yourselves.
sleeping.
All right, take care, man. Bye-bye.
Bye.